This time, Johnny brought me 20 pairs of scissors and challenged me. Could I turn all these scissors into something that would surprise everyone? Of course, I accepted the challenge. First, I smashed the plastic handles with a hammer and removed them from every pair of scissors. Then I built a steel container and packed all the scissors tightly inside. I filled every empty space with steel powder until the container was completely full. Once everything was packed inside, I sealed the container and fired up my charcoal forge. I placed the container deep into the hot coals, and once it reached a high temperature, I carefully began hammering it. At first, I used light, controlled blows from every side to compress everything evenly. I repeated the heating and hammering process several times until I could feel that everything inside had fused into one solid mass. Then I shut down the forge and allowed the container to cool. Once it was cold, I cut off both ends with an angle grinder and sliced open the outer shell. I peeled away the container steel and pulled out the fused core. 20 pairs of scissors had now become one solid piece of steel. So I fired up the forge again. This time, I heated the billet and started forging it much more aggressively. As you already know, I forge everything by hand with nothing but my hammer. No hydraulic press and no power hammer. That makes this kind of project extremely exhausting and time-consuming. I spent the entire day hammering the hot steel. First, I drew it out and flattened it into a long plate. Then I forged the tang for the handle, and finally, I shaped the blade tip. By the end of the day, this was the rough blade I had created. The next morning, I moved to the belt grinder. First, I refined the contours until the blade started taking its final shape. Some areas were impossible to reach with the belt grinder, so I carefully finished those details by hand with a file. Once I was satisfied with the profile, I started thinning and leveling both sides. There were still deep hammer marks and uneven areas left from forging, so I removed them until both surfaces were clean and flat. Then came one of the most important stages, grinding the bevels on both sides. The bevels give the blade its cutting geometry and also define much of its final appearance. Once the bevels were finished, I sanded the entire blade to 280 grit. Then I fired up the forge once again. I heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius and quickly quenched it in oil. Now the steel was hardened and much stronger. After heat treatment, I continued sanding, this time working all the way up to 1,500 grit. Then I cleaned the blade thoroughly and placed it into ferric chloride for several minutes, and this was the moment I had been waiting for. An incredibly beautiful pattern appeared across the surface of the blade. Now it was time to make the handle. I started with a very simple brass bolster. Then I selected a solid piece of Greek walnut and drilled it to the correct dimensions. I assembled the blade, bolster, and walnut handle using epoxy and left everything to cure overnight. The following day, I started shaping the handle on the belt grinder. I followed the outline I had drawn and carefully removed the excess wood until the handle reached the shape I wanted. Then I finished the rest by hand, sanding the walnut to 220 grit. Finally, I applied protective wax to the wood to help protect it from moisture in the future. I sharpened the blade all the way to 4,000 grit, and now it's razor sharp. And this is the final result, a knife made from 20 pairs of scissors. If you think Johnny is going to be impressed, subscribe to the channel.